In the blood-soaked expanse of the 19th century American frontier, the arrival of autumn did not bring the romanticized harvest festivals of the East. It brought a creeping, paralyzing dread that locked isolated families inside their fortified cabins. When the September full moon rose, casting a pale, ghostly luminescence over the southern plains, the settlers did not admire its beauty. They called it the Comanche moon.
A fine, sharp
and they prayed
carbine.
to a god
Worth
they
the
hoped
price
was
in horses.
listening.
The horse
Under
is
this
strong.
brilliant,
We agree to
unforgiving
the
light,
trade.
the most formidable light cavalry the world had seen since the Mongols was riding south. The Comanche, masters of a sovereign empire spanning 250,000 square miles, known as Comancheria, moved with the silence of phantoms across the landscape, their faces painted for war, slipping past military patrols and penetrating deep into the heart of Texas and the northern states of Mexico. They were not merely passing through, they were launching highly organized, devastating logistical operations. They came for the horses to fuel their military machine, for the cattle to feed their sprawling camps, and, most terrifyingly, they came for human beings, viewing the men, women, and children of the frontier as nothing more than a harvestable resource. History has often painted the Comanche raids as random acts of chaotic, mindless savagery, but the chilling truth uncovered by the archives reveals something far more sophisticated and sinister. By the early 1800s, the Comanche had transformed the terrifying violence of the raid into a calculated, highly lucrative economic system, a vast network of human trafficking and livestock laundering that formed the backbone of their geopolitical power. Young warriors understood that the path to absolute political influence and wealth was not through inheritance, but through the violent acquisition of foreign assets. While a stolen horse might be traded to opportunistic New Mexican merchants known as Comancheros for a mere $6 in manufactured goods, the trade in human flesh was astronomically more profitable. In the 1830s and 1840s, the going ransom price for a white captive was a staggering $400, an unimaginable fortune for a nomadic society that measured its wealth in buffalo robes and Mustang herds. The Comanche had learned a brutal capitalist lesson. Desperate families and embarrassed government officials would bankrupt themselves to buy back their stolen loved ones. The business model of the Comanche Empire was ruthlessly efficient, completely devoid of empathy, and designed for maximum yield. War parties would descend upon a settlement like a localized apocalypse, slaughter the adult men who posed a physical threat or offered no economic value, and seize the women and children before vanishing back into the labyrinth of the plains. These captives were not immediately ransomed. They were dragged into the deep interior of Comancheria, held in sprawling camps scattered across thousands of miles of unmapped territory, and deliberately kept isolated. The Comanche leadership would then negotiate the return of these broken souls, one agonizing transaction at a time, manipulating the desperation of the victims' families to extract every possible ounce of profit. This was not a war of extermination. It was a massive, transnational hostage-taking enterprise that funded the expansion of the Comanche military apparatus, turning the suffering of thousands into the very currency that kept the empire alive. To understand the sheer scale of this human harvesting operation, one must look beyond economics to the desperate biological crisis that was silently eating the Comanche nation alive from the inside out. Like nearly all indigenous populations of the Americas, the Comanche had been absolutely devastated by the invisible apocalypse of European contact. Waves of smallpox and cholera swept through their camps with the force of a scythe, repeatedly decimating a population that, at its absolute peak, never exceeded 40,000 individuals. Furthermore, the harsh, nomadic lifestyle of the plains meant that Comanche women suffered from unusually high rates of miscarriage and infant mortality. The empire was expanding territorially, but it was bleeding out demographically. The Comanche needed blood, they needed labor, and they needed wombs to replenish their dying ranks. Captives, particularly young women and children, were not just ransom fodder, they were the biological mortar used to repair the cracks in the Comanche foundation. By the time the tribe was finally forced onto reservations decades later, it is estimated that a staggering 30% of the entire Comanche population had captive blood flowing through their veins. This desperate demographic need, combined with the insatiable economic incentive, fueled an escalation of raiding that turned the borderlands into a landscape of unimaginable horror. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, Comanche war parties numbering in the hundreds penetrated hundreds of miles deep into the sovereign territory of northern Mexico, stripping entire provinces of their human and animal wealth. When United States troops invaded Mexico in 1846 during the Mexican-American War, they expected to fight the Mexican army, but instead, they marched through what horrified officers described as a ghost landscape. The American soldiers found abandoned highways, ruined villages, empty corrals, and scattered, sun-bleached corpses. They quickly realized that northern Mexico had already been conquered, gutted, and depopulated not by the artillery of the United States, but by the relentless, surgical strikes of Comanche raiders who had effectively turned the region into their own private raiding farm. The terror of this systemic harvesting was perfectly crystallized on a warm morning in May 1836 at a place called Fort Parker on the bleeding edge of Comancheria in modern-day Texas. The Parker family, believing they could carve out a life on the frontier, had built a fortified wooden compound to protect against exactly this kind of nightmare. But on that fatal morning, the heavy wooden gates were casually left open while the men worked the nearby fields. When a massive war party of Comanche, Kiowa, and Caddo warriors materialized from the brush, their faces painted in terrifying streaks of red and black, their heads crowned with helmets fashioned from the skulls and horns of buffalo, it was a scene of sudden, absolute doom. Benjamin Parker bravely walked out to negotiate, a fatal misunderstanding of the enemy's intent. Within seconds, he was impaled by lances, his body trampled beneath the hooves of war horses, and the raid instantly morphed into a localized massacre. The slaughter at Fort Parker was swift, efficient, and merciless. 5 men were hacked to pieces in the dirt, their blood watering the fields they had just plowed, while the warriors rode down the fleeing women and children, scooping them up like prizes from the blood-stained earth. Among those seized was Rachel Parker Plummer, a pregnant woman who was violently dragged onto a horse alongside her young son, clutching him as her world burned behind her. Her 9-year-old cousin, Cynthia Anne Parker, and younger brother John were also torn from the arms of their screaming relatives, along with another woman, Elizabeth Duty Kellogg. By nightfall, the once hopeful settlement of Fort Parker was nothing but a smoldering pile of ash and butchered corpses, and the captives were being driven relentlessly north into the absolute darkness of Comancheria, forced to ride until their skin was blistered and their muscles tore. The brutality of that very first night on the trail set a horrifying precedent for what Rachel Plummer was about to endure, initiating a descent into a psychological and physical hell that defied human comprehension. In her memoir, published after her eventual ransom, Rachel Plummer wrote with a chilling, evasive, carefully about the events of that first night, stating that she could not bring herself to describe the treatment directly. She wrote only that to speak of their barbarous treatment would add to her present distress, noting that the women were struck and subjected to acts she found too mortifying to record. In the restrictive, puritanical society of the 1830s, this heavy silence spoke volumes. It was a veiled confession of mass sexual violence and physical degradation, a reality where women were expected to preserve the illusion of their purity even when they were the victims of horrors completely beyond their control. Rachel's captivity would stretch into 21 agonizing months, a period of endless, grueling labor and relentless abuse. During this time in the unforgiving wilderness, she gave birth to a second son, a frail infant born into the nightmare of slavery. The true depth of the Comanche ruthlessness was revealed 6 weeks later when the warriors decided that Rachel's crying, fragile infant was slowing down their movement across the plains. Without a shred of hesitation or malice, simply viewing the child as a logistical liability, they tore the baby from Rachel's arms and violently ended its life right in front of her, crushing the infant while the mother screamed in helpless agony. Yet, in a twist that reveals the alien psychology of her captors, Rachel eventually realized that submission meant death. After months of being routinely beaten by the Comanche women who supervised her slave labor, Rachel snapped. She fought back fiercely against a supervisor, fully expecting to be lanced to death for her defiance. Instead, the warriors gathered around and watched with deep amusement. When Rachel emerged victorious from the brawl, her status instantly changed. The Comanche possessed no concept of racial superiority. They valued extreme violence, courage, and utility above all else. By proving she could fight like a cornered animal, Rachel earned their respect. The physical beating stopped. Her conditions improved, and she had inadvertently deciphered the brutal code of Comanche survival. While Rachel Plummer survived to write her harrowing account, the horrors inflicted upon another young captive would ignite a diplomatic crisis so explosive it permanently shattered any illusion of peace between the Comanche and the Republic of Texas. In the fall of 1838, 13-year-old Matilda Lockhart was snatched from her family's settlement on the Guadalupe River, vanishing into the violent void of the plains for nearly 2 years. When Comanche leaders, seeking to cash in on their human inventory, finally brought her to San Antonio in March 1840 for a ransom negotiation, the sight of the girl brought hardened, blood-soaked frontiersmen to tears. Matilda had been subjected to a campaign of physical mutilation so extreme it resembled medieval torture. Her face had been completely disfigured by deep, weeping burns. Her hair had been violently ripped from her scalp by the roots, and she had been beaten so severely that the muscles in her neck were damaged, leaving her physically unable to lift her head to look her rescuers in the eye. Mary Maverick, a local woman who interviewed the broken teenager privately, recorded a description that still chills the blood today. There was not a single place on Matilda's entire body as large as a human paw that had not been severely scarred, branded, or burned with heated iron tools. This was not disciplinary punishment for escape attempts. It was a ritualized, sadistic form of psychological displacement. Comanche women, waiting in the camps, frequently inflicted this horrifying treatment on female captives when their husbands and sons failed to return from raids or came back severely injured by Texan bullet. The white captives became the physical canvases upon which the grieving, enraged Comanche women painted their vengeance. Matilda, speaking through her pain, informed the horrified Texas commissioners that she had seen at least 15 other captives still suffering in the camps, and that the Comanche chiefs explicitly planned to bring them in one by one to extract the absolute maximum ransom for each tortured soul. The revelation of this calculated, agonizing extortion scheme caused the Texan commissioners to completely abandon all protocols of diplomatic immunity. When the Comanche delegation, led by Chief Muguara, arrogantly explained that they had no political authority to force other bands to release their prisoners, the Texans locked the doors of the stone building and ordered armed soldiers to seize the diplomats as hostages. The Comanche, who viewed ambassadors as sacred and untouchable even in times of total war, instantly drew their hidden weapons, preferring death in close-quarters combat to the humiliation of chains. The ensuing slaughter, etched into history as the Council House fight, was a bloodbath of unimaginable intimacy and violence. 35 Comanche men, women, and children were hacked, stabbed, and shot to death, their blood pooling on the stone floors of the Council House and running into the dusty streets of San Antonio. By violating the oldest rule of diplomacy, the Texans had unknowingly signed the death warrants of hundreds of their own citizens, unleashing a wave of vengeance that would set the entire frontier ablaze. The Comanche response to the betrayal at the council
should have
house
answered
was
me the
neither
first
swift
time.
nor chaotic. It was a meticulously planned apocalyptic wave of total destruction designed to erase the Texan settlements from the map. In the sweltering summer of 1840, a formidable Penateca war chief named Buffalo Hump united fiercely independent bands of warriors, forging a massive strike force of nearly 500 heavily armed riders. This was not a standard raid. This was a national mobilization for vengeance, accompanied by women and young boys whose sole purpose was to herd the thousands of horses they intended to steal. In what became known as the Great Raid of 1840, this unstoppable tidal wave of indigenous fury swept hundreds of miles through the Texas heartland, burning farms, slaughtering anyone caught in the open, and snatching fresh captives to replace those lost in San Antonio. When they reached the coastal shipping town of Linville, they found warehouses bursting with over $300,000 worth of imported luxury goods, a fortune that the warriors plundered with gleeful, surreal chaos. The nightmare reached its absolute peak as the warriors rode through the burning, screaming town, butchering the inhabitants while wearing stolen silk top hats, tailored coats, and carrying parasols, creating a macabre, a hallucinatory image of two colliding civilizations drowning in blood. Behind the dramatic headlines of massacres and burning towns lay the grinding, daily reality of the captives who were swallowed by the Comanche machine, a complex, rigid social hierarchy where survival required total psychological submission. Adult white men taken in raids were almost never kept alive. They were viewed as useless, dangerous liabilities, and were typically tortured to death on the spot to break the morale of the survivors.
Nearly lost the horse.
Women and children, however, were absorbed into a complex labor and breeding ecosystem. Buffalo hunting, the absolute core of the Comanche economy, was glamorous work for the men, but the horrific, back-breaking labor of processing the massive, rotting carcasses fell entirely on the women. Captive women were thrust into the lowest tier of this grueling hierarchy. They were forced to scrape fat from heavy hides until their fingers bled and their nails peeled off, cure mountains of meat in the blistering sun, haul massive loads of water and firewood, and constantly assemble and dismantle the heavy hide teepees as the nomadic camps moved. For women of childbearing age, this grueling slave labor was often compounded by forced marriage into the tribe. The Comanche practiced polygamy, and highly successful, wealthy warriors who owned massive herds of horses required multiple wives to process their buffalo hides and maintain their wealth. A captured woman was frequently taken as a secondary or tertiary wife, entering an ambiguous, terrifying social space that hovered somewhere between a prized possession and a despised beast of burden. Her daily treatment, her physical safety, and her access to food depended entirely on the temperament of her warrior husband and the jealousy of his senior native-born wives. The concept of race, as the Europeans obsessed over it, was completely irrelevant in Comanche. The tribe had seamlessly incorporated white settlers, escaped black slaves, Mexican peasants, and captives from rival Native American tribes. What mattered to the Comanche was not the color of your skin, but your absolute allegiance to the culture, your ability to endure extreme suffering, and your economic utility in a harsh, unforgiving world. While adult women were broken through labor and forced marriages, the children stolen from the frontier faced a vastly different, deeply insidious trajectory. Total, absolute, psychological reprogramming. Young captives were the most highly prized commodities in the Comanche raiding economy because their minds were still malleable enough to be completely wiped clean of their past identities. These children were not kept as slaves. They were officially adopted by Comanche families who had lost their own children to the devastating plagues of cholera and smallpox. This was not a token gesture or a temporary arrangement. The children were stripped of their European clothing, dressed in buckskin, and given new Comanche names, effectively killing their former selves. They were raised with genuine affection as true sons and daughters, taught to view the white world they came from as alien, weak, and hostile. The psychological trauma of the raid was slowly buried under a blanket of cultural immersion, creating a deeply ingrained form of societal Stockholm syndrome, where the captive learned to fiercely love their captors. For these young, assimilated captives, the boundless, wild life of the plains often proved incredibly seductive, offering a level of physical freedom that the rigid, puritanical farming settlements of their birth could never match. They learned to ride like demons before they were 10, learned the intricate language of the tribe, and came to view the endless sea of prairie grass as their true, sacred home. Boys were subjected to rigorous, often brutal training to become warriors, and the Comanche meritocracy meant that a white-born captive could rise to the very pinnacle of leadership, commanding war parties against the very people he was born to, provided he demonstrated unparalleled courage and martial skill. They learned the art of the ambush, the strategy of the raid, and the absolute necessity of violence for survival.
Moving the herd
The
tonight,
boys who once
heading
read
south
Bibles
towards
in
the
log
border.
cabins grew up to
If you
scalp
ride
the
now,
neighbors of
you
their
might catch
biological
them.
parents, feeling absolutely
You
no
will adhere
contradiction
to the
in their
law
actions
or
because
face
in
the
their minds
consequences.
they were
I will
completely,
not tolerate
unequivocally
this corruption
Comanche.
in my
Girls
jurisdiction.
captured before the onset of puberty faced a similar, though less violent, path of total cultural consumption. They were taught the exhaustive arts of women's work, learning to process the buffalo, forage for roots, and ride alongside the men during the frantic camp migrations. When they came of age, they were married off to chiefs or prominent warriors, not as degraded slaves, but as respected, full-blooded members of the society. These marriages lacked the horrific coercion experienced by adult captives, because by the time the girl reached marital age, she had absolutely no memory of her former life. The faces of her biological parents were forgotten, replaced entirely by the painted faces of her adoptive family. This total assimilation presents one of the most terrifying philosophical questions of the frontier. If a child's entire reality, language, and love are forcibly rewritten by the people who murdered their parents, at what point does the victim truly become the
need more
conqueror?
salt if
No
this
story
weather holds.
perfectly encapsulates the profound,
I sent the boys
heart-wrenching
out this
tragedy
morning.
of this
They
total
should be back
assimilation
soon.
better than that of Cynthia Anne Parker, the 9-year-old girl dragged screaming from the carnage of Fort Parker. Within a few short years, the terrified pioneer child ceased to exist, completely replaced by a fiercely loyal Comanche girl named Nadua, meaning someone found. As she grew, she was spotted multiple times by white traders and Indian agents who ventured into the sprawling Comanche camps. Men who recognized her blue eyes and offered massive ransoms of mules and manufactured goods to buy her freedom. Every single time, the offers were met with aggressive refusal, not just from her adoptive Comanche parents, who swore they would rather die than surrender her, but from Nadua herself. When Indian agent Leonard Williams finally managed to speak to her directly in 1846, offering a king's ransom for her release, the 19-year-old Nadua kept her eyes stubbornly fixed on the dirt, refusing to speak a single word of English. Though Williams noted her lips trembled with repressed emotion, she had no desire to be rescued. A return to the white world meant a terrifying exile from the only family she knew. Nadua's integration into the Comanche aristocracy was absolute. She married Peta Nocona, a rising, incredibly dangerous young warrior who would eventually become one of the most influential and feared chiefs on the southern plains. By all historical accounts, their marriage was a union of deep, genuine affection. Nocona broke with established Comanche tradition and remained strictly monogamous, taking no other wives despite his immense wealth and status. Nadua bore him 3 children, 2 fierce sons, Quana and Pecos, and a beloved daughter named Topsana, or Prairie Flower. She lived the grueling, exhilarating life of a warrior's wife, moving constantly across the high plains, and some historians suspect she even rode alongside Nocona on his brutal raids, managing the stolen horse herds and perhaps even overseeing the new captives. She was Nadua, mother of the future Comanche resistance, a woman who had completely shed the skin of her tragic past. But the brutal machinery of the frontier was not finished with her. And in December 1860, the violence that had forged her would return to destroy her a second time. Texas Rangers and heavily armed U.S. cavalry, tracking a recent bloody raid, descended upon Nokona's small, vulnerable camp on the Pease River at the break of dawn. In the screaming chaos of the surprise attack, the Rangers slaughtered the inhabitants, and Nadua, desperately trying to flee while clutching her infant daughter, Prairie Flower, was violently run down and captured. Beneath the layers of grease, dirt, and sun-baked skin, a ranger noticed her startling blue eyes, and through broken, forgotten English, she managed to identify herself. After 24 years, the lost girl of Fort Parker had been rescued. But to Nadua, this was not a salvation. It was a horrific second kidnapping. Dragged back to a wooden house near Birdville by her uncle, Isaac Parker, she found herself imprisoned in a terrifying alien world. She desperately tried to escape multiple times, stealing horses in the night, trying to ride back to the endless plains to find her sons. But the frontier was closing, and she was trapped. She was forced to perform the grotesque pantomime of living as a white woman, all while she secretly performed the bloody Comanche mourning rituals, slicing her own arms and chest with a knife, and wailing a keening, unearthly song of grief for her dead husband that horrified her puritanical relatives. When the brutal Indian Wars finally ended in the 1870s and the starving, defeated Comanche were herded onto the desolate reservations north of the Red River, the U.S. government forced them to release all their remaining captives. This mandate created a final, agonizing humanitarian crisis. Dozens of captives, now fully grown adults who had spent decades as Comanche warriors, wives, and mothers, faced an impossible, devastating choice. They were torn from their Comanche spouses, separated from their mixed-blood children, and forced back into a white society that viewed them with suspicion and disgust. For these individuals, the government's liberation was the ultimate trauma, a violent severing of their identities built over a lifetime of survival. They became ghosts, haunting the borderlands, people caught permanently between two warring worlds, belonging fully to neither, carrying the indelible scars of a frontier that demanded blood, erased histories, and ultimately forced the victims to answer the impossible question: when the world you knew is burned to ash, who do you become to survive the fire? Medieval Spirits Out.